Rolling, very polite, please.
Around the Daily Wire, our founder, Jeremy Boring, likes to refer to himself as the God King, rightly so. I like it when people sort of hail me as I walk by, but none of us have any actual claims to nobility, any proper titles. And today, I am joined by an actual Archduke. Not only an Archduke, but the ambassador to the Holy See from Hungary, probably the greatest job in the world. I am joined by my friend, Eduard Habsburg. Eduard, thank you for being here.
Good morning.
So I have to congratulate you on something. Not merely on your very interesting career, which I'm sure we'll get into, not merely on writing a marvelous book, which we'll also get into. You have done the impossible. You have redeemed the genre of self-help. I despise self-help books, and yet when I cracked open your book, it was magnificent. And I don't know even how to categorize it. Is it self-help? Is it history? Is it a personal memoir? Is it all of the above?
I would say, if I tell you how it came about, you will understand a bit better. I was asked by a friend whether I could write a book on the Habsburgs for the American public for Sophia Press. And I said, okay, I'll do that, but I won't just write a family history, because that's boring. And there are very good family histories. So, and then I remember that I gave a talk in Boston where I was supposed to speak about my family and our values. And the host told me, for God's sake, don't just talk about the Catholic faith of the Habsburgs, because some of the guests tonight are not Catholic. So I said, okay, what else do we have? And I began making a list. And when Sophia Press wanted a book, I took that list out again and said, I think I have an idea. And then I began to research. And while researching these 7 central principles that our family stood for, I began thinking, and I began saying, this stuff isn't around as much as it used to be. These 7 things are perhaps something that has gone missing today. And then I said, why don't I propose each of these 7 values to people today? And this was a gradual thing. At the beginning, I didn't plan out to make this a self-help book, but it sort of evolved into that, and it was great fun. And when I was on tour here in the States, and when I talk about these topics to American readers, there is an incredible echo. They understand what I'm talking about, and that's fantastic. Absolutely fantastic.
You come to the book not only with this illustrious family and not only with what you're doing now in diplomacy, but you've had kind of a bizarre career.
Bizarre?
I would say in only the best way, but you've worked in media, you've worked in communications, you've worked in religious life, you've kind of been all over the place. There was a New York Times profile of you.
Oh, yes.
And it mentioned that you wrote a zombie movie.
Yes. I wrote a really, really cool zombie movie. It was set in Austria, and it was optioned. I earned a little bit of money, and then like 4/5 of all projects, it never took off. But one day I'll see it done. You see, I have 6 children, and with my growing number of children, I had to take different jobs to keep our little family boat afloat. So I worked for a bishop as a spokesman. I wrote a thesis in philosophy, on Thomistic philosophy. I made a TV series, but for about 7-8 years, I was a screenwriter. And before that, I was a cartoon producer, animated cartoon producer. I'm an incredible cartoon fan and anime fan, which the greatest tweet I ever had from the number of clicks was simply a frame from a Neon Genesis Evangelion movie where I said that this is the last place where you can see classical animation. And people just freaked out because Habsburg and Weeb doesn't go together.
No.
And but it does. So you're right, I had a very checkered career until the Hungarian government asked me to become ambassador. And I told them, I'm not your guy. I'm not a respectable ambassador. I wrote a zombie screenplay.
I just can't believe that it took bringing my Austrian Archduke friend into the studio to make me hip with all of these terms about anime and cartoons, and I don't really
Do you ever watch anime? Do you know?
I-
You know what the Weeb is?
I don't know what a weeb is.
That's a fan of anime movies. So that it all came naturally. I worked at the television German company producing children's television at the beginning of our marriage, and then I was sort of hired by a company producing animated cartoons, and I produced 2 animated TV series, and then I fell in love with animation, and then I fell in love with screenplays, and so I got to screenwriting, and then when I was about 7 years in with screenwriting, and I had 1, 2 movies produced, a few TV series where I had participated, I realized that with 4 to 5 children, you can't survive as a writer. And then I went to present myself to the Bishop of St. Pölten in Austria, which is a small diocese beside Vienna. And he happened to be the pro-life bishop of the Austrian Bishops' Conference, the one for bioethical questions, the one who has to speak up when all the other bishops take the collar off the wall because it's unpleasant topics like euthanasia and abortion and gay marriage and these things. Then it was his job to speak up. And as he was someone who didn't enjoy media and didn't enjoy sitting in front of microphones, he says, why don't you help me with this? So my first job was to simply meet all the journalists in Austria who ever write about church, have coffee with them, win them over, explain them what a bishop does, and explain to the bishop what they need. And my current job as ambassador is very similar. I have to explain to the Holy See what Hungary does, and to Hungary what the Holy See does. So yes, it doesn't seem all to make sense, but actually it does.
Right.
And if you read my book, you will see that all the topics in there, the Habsburg element fits together with Hungarian Ambassador element, fits together with my Catholic faith element, and fits together with my crazy career. It all came together in that book.
No, this is what really struck me about it was I don't like viewing history as just one damn fact after another, as some people describe it. It seems to me that if history is going to have any meaning at all, then it's going to be tied inextricably to the personal stories of the people involved, whose descendants we see around us today. It's going to be tied to religion. It's going to be tied to things that matter. It's going to be tied to philosophy and government and all the rest of it. It's going to be tied even to practical concerns such as, how do I feed my 6 children? And so this is the first of the rules that you lay out in the Habsburg Way. The first rule is 2 parts: get married and have lots of children.
Yes, yes.
And you've done it.
First of all, in script writing, there's a rule: write what you know. And and I didn't want to begin with a Catholic topic of Habsburg because I didn't want to roll over those of my readers who perhaps were not as devout and as Catholic as I was. So I decided I'd begin with a marriage topic. Historically, the Habsburgs are known for their marriage politics, for having lots of children, for marrying them off. But in my private life, as you just said, I got married, I had lots of children. I thought that I had lots of children until I landed now here in the States and came to my first Catholic dinner and I was presented, and I'm used to, when I say I have 6 children, that in Europe everybody says, and I came here and the first 3 women I greeted told me they have 9, 9 and 10 children, and you could see a look of pity in their eyes that I had 6 children.
A small Catholic family.
Yes, a small. Yeah, well, perhaps the Lord will give some more. There was something of, not sad, but no. But what I'm trying to say is, my experience in my life is that having lots of children is the greatest gift you can give yourself, your spouse, and most of all the children. Each of those children will be a gift to have more siblings. It sounds reactionary, but it's reality. And I can tell now that my children are between 14 and 26, what kind of gang we have created, what kind of close group where they look after each other. One of my central experiences is, and also the reason why every state should encourage families to have many children, and you do this by giving subsidies and by talking well about numerous families. Why every state should encourage this is because around the dinner table you learn all the virtues that you need to build a just, good, and merciful state. You learn all of this, and the more siblings you have, the better you learn it. You're always a bit hungry, you're always nervous whether you will get enough to eat, but you know that the youngest child always gets first. And this is how you learn that the weakest needs to be looked after. And then, you know, I've got one son and 5 daughters, so the conversation around the table was always very vivid and very loud and very intense. And the youngest wants to say something and just doesn't get through the noise and tries twice and then runs out crying. The siblings learn we have to give a voice to the youngest and not just to us who are loud. And if I am hungry, I will let the weakest eat first. And you learn from each other. You listen to your siblings. You try to emulate what they do. You sometimes criticize. It is, if you want, the nucleus. This is the place where you build people who will build a good and just society tomorrow. I think it's far more difficult if you grow up alone, because especially now, if you grow up alone, you will, the danger that you will be slave to the screen, slave to your phone, slave to every fad that goes through the world is far greater. If you're in a family, you cannot afford that much. You simply cannot afford that much. You have to think twice before you go on a holiday. You are not so easily swayed by money, by fame, by fortune, by luxury, by consuming things, because you have to count your dollars. So all of that, from my personal point of view. Now, for the Habsburgs, they're famous for marriage politics. Why is that the case? Why did the Habsburgs, from the very first moment of the first Habsburg becoming emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, why did the Habsburgs didn't, enlarge their empire by conquest, by bloody battles, by attacking their neighbors, but by marriage politics? Because the Holy Roman Empire is something very different from the empire we know from Star Wars, where one evil emperor suppresses an entire galaxy and all the planets through stormtroopers. The Holy Roman Emperor was someone who had authority. He had a quasi sacral status. He was anointed, but he had no real power. He had no armies. He had no money, and he was to be the judge, the supreme judge in the Holy Roman Empire. And he was overseeing an incredibly checkered and complicated chessboard of different dukedom, kingdom, princedom, languages, legal systems. And his job basically was to keep peace. So you can only do this by negotiation, by being diplomatic. And the best way to create peace with neighbors is by marrying two children. They come into the family. If you have a marriage, the chance that these two countries will fight each other becomes smaller. It was very natural. It was the only way when Rudolph Von Habsburg, our first king of the Holy Roman Empire in 1273, took over the crown, he had to put order into the Holy Roman Empire that had lain without emperor for 25 years. And he rebuilt the law, he rebuilt everything. But most of all, he had to take back the countries that had been taken by local rulers during the absence of the emperor. And in the end, he had to do it by battle. But before that, Ottokar of Bohemia, who had basically stolen Austria, large parts of Austria, from the empire, he tried to convince him, he negotiated, he offered his children in marriage to his children. That was this. And only when that didn't work out, in the end, he beat him in the greatest knightly battle of the Middle Ages, Dürnkrout. Pretty cool. And so sorry, I was wondering.
Well, this leads into another rule, which is one that I think a lot of Americans are going to recoil at before they read the chapter, which is believe in the empire. And Americans, we say, no, we're nationalists. We want the nation state. The nation state is how you protect people's rights and customs, and the empire is all they ever do. It's like Star Wars. They just come in and suppress everybody, and so we don't want any of that.
Yes. Well, what surprised me most when I wrote this book was the amount of similar ideas in the Habsburg Empire and in the United States. I reread Tocqueville, American Democracy, before I came here. And there are principles that are very similar. And one principle is the rule has 2 parts, believe in the empire and in subsidiarity. I believe that subsidiarity is one of the key words for our time. It is also the ultimate antidote to globalism. And I think it is the answer to many fears that people have nowadays. And it was the principle of the Habsburg Empire.
Even though many people, including in America, which built its government essentially on subsidiarity,
yes,
many people don't know what it even means.
Yes, but it's incredibly important. So I give you a definition of subsidiarity without the word subsidiarity from the 16th century. Emperor Charles V, he of an empire where the sun never set, ruling over Spain and half of the world. He told his son, Philip II, if you rule over several nations, you better respect their laws, their languages, their rights, their legal systems, their parliaments, and their special attitudes, or you will be in deep trouble. And so the Habsburgs always had to deal with different nations under them. And whenever the Habsburgs respected every single one of these nations and their languages and their habits, the empire went well. Whenever the Habsburgs tried to centralize, tried to build, so to speak, a very powerful federal level that pulled everything to a center, then there were problems in the Habsburg Empire. Now, America is built grassroots up. You're built around the family, homestead, county, state, and the federal level, at least in the beginning, was rather weak. And the state is strong. You are United States. You still are. As you could tell in the last 2 or 3 years, when some states just decided to do things a bit differently than the federal level would have wanted. This is also the experience in the Habsburg Empire. You always have the wish and desire of the Habsburg Emperor to pull everything. For instance, Joseph II. Joseph II was one who really put his foot in. His mother not. His mother, Maria Theresia, she with her 16 children. We are now in the year 1780. He admired Frederick of Prussia. And Frederick of Prussia had built a very strong, enlightened nation-state of Prussia, with one language, one centralized government, like a clockwork. And suddenly their economic problems were gone, their army was... So Joseph II, who was he was a fanboy of Frederick of Prussia.
Who wasn't? Who wouldn't?
Be, you know? Yeah, well. Anyway, I'm not. My grandfather used to say, Frederick II, whom some people call the Great, and he said, I will do the same thing in Austria. I want an enlightened empire where, and what he did was introduce one language, centralize everything to Vienna, take away all the local parliaments and rights, take away the crowns. He took the crown, the Hungarian crown, and brought it to Vienna and locked it away in the Schatzkammer in Vienna, because we don't need different crowns. We are one empire. And that led to turmoil, to rebellions, to anger. Towards the end of his empire, he realized that he had messed up. And when his brother followed him, Leopold II, he tried to repair the worst damage that he had done. Why am I saying all of this? Because the United States have to rediscover this element. In the European Union, we feel that we have the problem that sometimes our friends in Brussels, I'm speaking now as Hungarian Ambassador, put on the other hat, our friends in Brussels want to interfere in our legislation in Hungary. Yeah. For instance, 1 year ago, we made a legislation to keep gender ideology out of schools, away from minors, around schools. And there was fury, anger, howling, and accusations, and we're still not out of it. But they simply don't respect our legal institutions. This law goes with our laws, and we have decided to do so. Right. So here you have a case where subsidiarity would simply respect this. And yes.
I can't help but notice in the case of Hungary, too, Hungary seems to be the only European country getting things right now. It's the only country that has managed to turn around the birth rate problem. You've got declining birth rates throughout the West, including in America, and one country has turned that curve in the other direction. You mentioned earlier that one way to do this is through subsidies, so the government just paying you. If you have 4 kids, okay, you don't have to pay income taxes, let's say.
Exactly.
Just hypothetically, to pull a policy out. So why is everyone beating up on Hungary? I guess that's why, because Hungary is so successful at resisting this wave of liberalism.
Well, you have to see that Hungary has two elements. One of them, we have a right-wing government that has been just elected for the fourth time consecutive, and this time with more voices than the last time, more votes than the last time, and we didn't really expect it. So Orban must be doing something right, but he's a conservative, and that doesn't fit into a certain narrative. And the second reason is, Orban's, in a speech in Italy, he said, we often hear from Frau von der Leyen and from other European leaders, Hungary and Poland, Central European countries, don't stand for European values anymore. And then he said, so I asked these people, if Schuman, de Gasperi, and Adenauer, the founders of the European Union, would come back today, where would they find the European values? In Brussels or in Central Europe? So Hungary simply remained what Europe always was, and what were our roots and sovereignty, nation, faith, family, and traditional values. And the others didn't. So it's natural that we're a bit the bad guys, the bad boys in Europe, and the Hungarians also say things outright the way they feel. They don't chisel away until it pleases the majority. People like Orban just say what they think. He's a Calvinist, strong, upright, Protestant, and outspoken, and that isn't exactly popular in Europe right now.
It reminds me of this meme of someone standing still. You've got the political left and the political right. He's standing still, and then the whole politics moves to the right, to the left, rather.
Yes.
And so now all of a sudden, that person who was a moderate, now he's firmly on the right. Elon Musk said this about himself.
Yes.
Ronald Reagan said, "I didn't leave my party, the Democrats. The party left me."
Yes.
And so what you're saying is, Hungary has just remained kind of normal, and the rest of Europe has gone off on these wild campaigns, the fruits of which we see before us.
There is a Gary Larson cartoon where you see the couch lying the cow lying on the couch with a psychiatrist, with her udder and all, and psychiatrist taking notes, and the cow says, "Of course, it could be that the rest of the herd has gone insane." Yeah. And I think about that a lot.
Right.
I think about that a lot.
Well, I suppose the biggest problem with all of this is that the Western society now seems untethered from any reality, moral reality, theological reality, now even biological reality. We've just disconnected ourselves from that. And one of the rules in the book is stand for law and justice.
Yes.
And we have lawlessness, especially throughout the United States, conveniently timed with the election cycle. Just before the elections, the mobs start coming out, the riots happen, but you see a breakdown of law and order. And I wonder if part of that is because the modern liberal view of the law is that the law is whatever we say that it is.
Yes, yes. I absolutely agree on this. We have so grown accustomed to the idea that we can't trust our politicians anymore. And I think most people would want to trust their politicians. They would want to have upright people who stand for law and for order, and who are ready to give a lot for their voters. But we sort of lost that trust in a way, and that, in my opinion, also explains the attraction for the Habsburgs. The Habsburgs, I mean, of course, I'm biased, but the Habsburgs rulers were, by and large, really upright, good, law-abiding people who wanted to be there for their subjects. Of course, the figure symbolizing all of this is Blessed Emperor Karl, our last emperor. I spoke with a Spectator journalist a few days ago. He didn't even know who that was. And outside of the Catholic, say, bubble, nobody realizes that after 70 years of Emperor Franz Joseph, at the end of the First World War, there was another emperor. There was another emperor, the last Habsburg emperor. In the Catholic world, he's a giant. He's a humble giant of faith.
So he's been beatified, which is the first step on the way to being canonized a saint.
Yes, exactly. He's been beatified. And if you look at his life, and that, I think, is the reason why last year I went to Dallas and I gave a talk on Blessed Emperor Karl in a hall. There were 700 people in that room. I would say the majority were young. There were about 50 babies. There were families, and everybody loved Blessed Emperor Karl. Because he stands for all these values that we seem to have lost a bit. And he was incredibly upright as a family father and as a husband. He was incredibly upright in his job, and his job happened to be emperor in the last 1.5 years. And he did something that I've never heard anywhere else. When he went into exile and his countries had sent him into exile, and he was on the island of Madeira, and he walked one day and he looked over to the church, and then he said, yes, I will do it. And his wife asked him 2 or 3 days later, what was that about? And he said, I have offered God my life for my people, so they can have peace. And then later, when he lay dying, and he had sort of a few weeks of illness, and it was really painful, and he really, really suffered, he always repeated, I have to suffer so much so that my people can be together and in peace. And he did this in prayer. And you know, what he did is also very reachable for each one of us. He lived his family life as a Christian. He lived his job as a Christian. The social teaching of the church infused everything he did as an emperor. And he died like a Christian. And every one of us can do that. We don't have to do something gigantic. This is the things that you become a saint through. If you die like a Christian, and he did that, if you offer up, this is the last topic of my book, of course, Die Well.
Probably the most controversial by modern standards. Because today we have a category called euthanasia, which literally means good death.
Yes.
And what do they mean by the good death today? Suicide.
Wow. In fact, that is, you make a point. I never realized that euthanasia, of course, is die well. Okay, wow. Okay.
Quite the opposite of how we used to mean the term.
I would come with a painting. You know, in the 15th, 16th century, there are quite a lot of paintings of Saint Christopher, the giant that carries Jesus on his shoulder across the water. Why are there so many paintings of Saint Christopher? He was considered to be the one who keeps you from a bad death. What was a bad death? A sudden death. Now, if you make a poll among people, how do you want to die? I would say 90% of the people would say quick without knowing, sudden without suffering.
Turn the lights off.
That was the contrary of a good death. In the Christian 16th century, a good death was one where you had the time to prepare yourself, where you even might suffer, but you might offer this up, which would ease your way to heaven when you died. So good death is neither a sudden death without warning in sleep, God please not, and it's neither being switched off by somebody. A good death is accepting what God sends your way with love, because this is the way you become a saint. And that may be a car crash, and that may be a long suffering in a hospital bed, carried with prayer, with love, and with acceptance. Mm-hmm. This is the way how you become a saint. And Blessed Carol did just that. And this is something that everyone can do. You don't have to be a superstar to do that. And most of all, that's a situation everybody will be in. It's one of the very few certainties in our life is that we're going to die, and also that we don't know how we're going to die. So this is a big topic in my book, and the story that touches me most among my ancestors, and well, she's not an ancestor, but members of my family, about a good death, is a story. I would like to tell that story. Is a story of Marie Antoinette's death.
A woman who was very unfairly maligned.
Who never said, let them eat cake.
Yeah, right.
This is one of those classical fake quotes that have been proven to be wrong, but will never go away because they are so wonderful, because they fulfill our prejudice. Marie Antoinette was not just Queen of France, but she was a Habsburg. She was the daughter of Maria Theresia, she of the 16 children. And she was married off to marry the Dauphin of France, the future King of France, the future Louis XVI. She was devout, instructed by her mother how to say her prayers, and she arrived in France, and I think it was a good marriage. She had a slightly superficial side. She was a bit vain. She wasn't wearing gym shoes like in the Sofia Coppola movie, but there was that, and she I think she enjoyed the court life quite a lot. But she was always a Catholic. And when then the revolution came and La Terreur came and they were arrested and they were put in prison, and then her husband was decapitated under the guillotine, and then it was her turn, she suffered because she couldn't go to confession. The revolution wouldn't grant her a Catholic priest because all Catholic priests in France, if they were caught, were killed immediately. So she couldn't have a Catholic priest visiting her to hear her confession. That for her was horrible because she hadn't confessed for a while and she didn't know if she was in a state of grace. Now just imagine if this is a priority in your life. You're not terrified of death, you're terrified of not being in a state of grace.
Right.
So she begged and she pleaded and no, didn't give her a priest. And the story is so nice because we don't have it from her, but we have it from a very unsuspecting narrator. And it's a book that everybody should read once. It's written by Charles-Henri Sanson. And he was the executioner of Paris from an old dynasty of executioners. And he wrote a book about La Terreur, about all the people whose heads he cut off with the guillotine, Robespierre, all the revolutionary, and also her. He always describes like how I came to get them, how we drove on our little cart through the cobblestone streets of Paris, and what they said during those few minutes until we got to the guillotine, and how they died. How they died is always the same. You get laid down and
Chop, chop.
so yeah, chop, chop. So with her, he describes, he was sitting beside her, and that's a moment, by the way, that has been captured by David, by the famous painter. There is a sketch of her when she rolled by, hands tied behind her back, with her hair rather short. And Sanson said she was incredibly nervous and unhappy and looking around all the time at the houses and really, truly unhappy. And he didn't understand why. Well, of course. And then
At least one reason.
they drove past one house, and she looked up, and she was in peace. And she remained in peace all the way to the guillotine, serene, happy, and in peace. She walked up the steps to the guillotine. She accidentally stepped on his foot. She said, "Pardon, excusez-moi, monsieur." That was her last words, and then she was killed. And Sanson never understood what happened, so he went back and he looked at the house. And after the revolution, underground Catholics told him what had happened. And that's incredible. Catholics knew that she had begged for a priest and never got one. So they sent her a message into the prison that at a certain point on the trip, in a certain house, but she didn't know which one, at one window, they would smuggle in a Catholic bishop. And he would give her an absolution in extremis. She saw him, and everything was good. And why do I tell this story? Just to tell you that even when Habsburgs were superficial, they had their priorities right. And being in a state of grace when you die is a priority that's really important. And in my book, you will find other stories of that kind. And that's why I think the chapter 7, Die Well, is the most important chapter in my book. And I could have put it first because it really shaped the lives of most of the Habsburg emperors. Not all, a few of them, unfortunately, didn't take this so serious. And we know this, unfortunately. It's very sad. We have to pray for them. But most of them did.
I can't help but notice that we don't see death anywhere today. We don't hold wakes really anymore. We rarely see dead bodies. We hold these degraded kinds of funerals where it'll be long after the fact, and we just try to get the fact of death out of our minds. People pray to the God that they often don't believe in to kill them in the dead of night when they don't know what's coming. We take all sorts of drugs to get it off of our mind. And so we can be happy that we don't see people dropping down around us. There's no pestilence coming around, no matter what Dr. Fauci says. But the flip side of that is, what are we living for? You know, I will die. That is one thing that I know for sure. I will be forced to pay my taxes, and I will die. And so I'm reminded of a line from Dr. Johnson, which is, "Depend upon it, sir, when a man knows he's to be hanged in a fortnight, it concentrates the mind wonderfully." It does, and it focuses your life. So if we lose the reality, if we lose the sense of the reality of our own deaths,
Yes.
then how do we order the whole rest of our lives? Just sort of amuse ourselves, I guess.
Death was something normal up until very few years ago. Now it's something anonymous in hospitals. The only kind of death we meet is terrorist attacks, mass shootings, and traffic accidents. You used to die in your family's house with the children around praying. That used to be the normal way of death. Every young person had seen a grandfather die and had prayed for them, had prayed the wake at their body. Blessed Karl called in his son Otto, who told me when he was an old man that he remembered exactly. He called him in an hour before he died while he was in the battle of dying. And he said, call him in, he has to see how an emperor dies. So, yeah, quite tough. And it was terrible for him, terrible. But he said he has to see this. He has to see that you have to die as a Christian. But what I'm trying to say is we have to get our priorities right. We know that we're going to die. We better prepare for it. And I believe that the moment of your death plays a role for your eternal life. I strongly believe this. And you can't say like, okay, when I'm about to die or the time before, I will begin to pray and I will turn to God and I will pray. It's like jogging. You cannot begin to jog without, you can't begin to jog by watching videos, and you can't begin to jog without training. You have to begin and you have to train that all your life if you want to run a marathon, and dying is a marathon. It's really a marathon. So you have to prepare this all your life. The Habsburgs were acutely aware. They were also aware that their death was public. The way they died would be reported to people, and their subjects would know about this, and they would take their cues from the way the emperor died. So you weren't even private in death, because your death would be reported in all detail, when you died, whether you went to the sacraments, all of that.
You know, that reminds me of a role of a father or a mother in a family, which is when your children are around, there is never even one little flinch on your face that can be called private, because the little kids are always soaking up everything. So the words you use, and we live in a culture that is obsessed with privacy. And it's sort of paradoxical because we have cameras everywhere all of our lives. Yes. Data go out everywhere. Yes. But we think that we have a right to privacy all of the time. And then I think of cultures that are a little bit more old school. The Italians come to mind, where the Italians don't have a word for privacy. Yes. So the Italian word for privacy is la privacy. Yes. Io vorrei la privacy. So we're so obsessed now with this idea that no, I have a right to do whatever I want in the privacy of my own mind and the privacy of my own home. And yet what that can cause then is scandal, which is another word that we don't really use much anymore. Now we talk about it, some celebrity goes to a nightclub, but scandal is a stumbling block, that if a ruler dies in a humiliating and degrading way, if a father or mother does something that's humiliating and degrading, that is going to scandalize the people around them. Yes.
We are so on Politikon. We are built for community. We are built for being together with others. We live in a world where our technocratic rulers, our media, our apps try to tell us you're alone, you enjoy your life alone, you live for yourself, you have to gratify all your desires, and you can afford it, and this is the way you become happy, alone. Family and living together and living on top of each other is the absolute antidote to that. You cannot, as you said, you cannot afford to get angry, let all your emotions run, because you're responsible for children around you who watch you, who learn from you, who take their cue from you, who admire you, and who will take their ideas of life from their father. So that's why many people, I don't think, want to get into marriage, because they feel that they might have to give up some of that total liberty that you seem to have now, which of course doesn't make you happy. And the idea of committing for life to someone else and creating a family and having children all around you, which doesn't allow you to do anything you had before, is so frightening, I think, mostly to men nowadays. I think many women still know that this is the thing and would like to. That we have a crisis also of marriages, because people they don't know who they are. They don't know what their roots are. They don't know how they're built. We don't know that men and women are different. We don't know that they are made for each other, complementary. All these things we don't know anymore. There's only you, the screen, and the account where you pay. And that's terrible. That's terrible.
Even many people, when they do get married, I've noticed this among friends and acquaintances and people in my life, they'll get married, but they'll say, okay, but we're not going to have children. We're going to choose. Some people can't have children. That's just the way life goes.
We're going to enjoy life.
That's right. Yeah, we're just going to go. We just want to travel or something. Or they'll say, well, we're going to get married, but we're going to have separate bank accounts, and we're going to. And they'll negotiate every aspect of their marriage like it's an accounting firm. They'll refer to their spouse as a partner. A partner, like I have. Here's my business partner over here, and here's my home partner over here. So there's a holding back.
Absolutely.
For what? In case of divorce? Okay, it'll be cleaner then. Well, then why are you getting married in the first place?
Getting married is losing yourself. Getting married also entails that you lose your total freedom that you had up to then for another person, for love, and for building something together that is so 100 times greater than what you have lived before that, because it's open for life, it's open for children. So some people get together and they have a relationship and they enjoy that part of it, but they won't have children, and they will put up having children, as if you couldn't enjoy life anymore and each other anymore if you have children. Yeah. It's absolutely ridiculous. And what I feel is having children was the greatest thing in my life.
Of course.
It is like, up to then, you played the piano on one octave, like this. With children, you realize that you have 2 more octaves here, 2 more here. You can use your feet. It's incredible, and that's what we are made for. This is how humans lived for the last 10,000s of years. But some people just cut themselves off, and then, of course, if people live together and then have 1 child or 2 children without really wanting, this goes horribly wrong. It always goes. My advice is, don't live together before marriage, don't have a sexual relationship before marriage, check the other person out with your ratio intact, have long talks about whether you have the same values. One of the topics in my book, in the marriage chapter, is about you should have the same values, the same ideas about marriage, the same faith, please. It makes things so much easier, because men and women are so different that if you have the same faith, it helps. You have to check all these things out. And you'll have decades time for sex afterwards. Yeah. You don't, it's not the most important thing in the world.
Yeah, it's perfectly enjoyable.
It's got, yeah. But what you have here is a total, the priorities have been put on the head.
Yeah.
And people are lost.
And I love your point on how it's good to have the same values and ultimately, to come together and really view life the same way and agree on what reality is, because when there's a marital spat, these are sometimes in the news. Yeah. They're framed as a battle of 2 wills. I want this and I want this, and whichever will is most expressive is going to dominate the other will. But that's not really how a marital spat should be. It's not really how any relationship should be in a civilized society, because we ought to be able to use our reason to say, this isn't just pie in the sky. I've actually put this into practice, and
you're married?
I'm married, to my long-suffering wife, who's quite sanctified every moment she's with me. But if you have a disagreement about something, you can use your reason then and say, okay, well, here is why I believe that we ought to go to McDonald's tonight. Mm-hmm. Well, no, here's why I believe we ought to go to Burger King tonight, or whatever the conflict is, and you can make an argument. And if you share the same premises. If you say, well, this is what men and women are made for, this is what our community is about, this is what God is like, this is what we believe, and we ought to order society, then you're much more likely to come to a solution that will be acceptable.
Yes. Well, if you look at my chapter on marriage in the Habsburg book, I have a rather controversial chapter in it on the famous inbreeding. Because of course
I wasn't going to bring it up.
No, sorry, but I have to do it because it is like Habsburg joy and inbreeding is 2 of the things that I hear all the time on Twitter when people think they want to be funny or they want to provoke me. They throw something in, or they throw a picture of one of those Habsburgs with a lower lip, and And they think they're very witty, and they think this time they really got me. They really got me. But they don't, of course. So, and there is, it's a fact. In the 16th century and in the 17th century, there were two Habsburg lines. There was the Austrian line and there was the Spanish line. They were cousins somehow. And what they did is, over 150 years, they married quite often between those two lines. The reason was not some weird idea of pure blood or something. But
this is what I was taught. In middle school, I was taught that the Habsburgs in particular, but a lot of royalty and nobility, they all married their cousins because they felt that they didn't want to pollute their bloodline with those filthy commoners.
That was the Egyptian pharaohs. That's 7,000 years ago. I'm talking about the Habsburgs. They did this for two reasons. For one reason, to keep the empire together, to keep those two branches together and in communication. But there was a side effect, and out of those, I think 74 marriages between Vienna and Spain, nearly all of these marriages were very happy marriages for both spouses. Now, the circumstances are not what we today would consider ideal. You never met your spouse until the day of your wedding. You lived in Vienna, they lived in Spain. You wrote each other's letters, you exchanged portraits, but you never met, actually. Then you were shipped over, had a long trip of several months to meet your spouse, either to Vienna or to Spain, and then you met for the first time. And then you were supposed to produce lots of children and have a happy marriage. But these marriages very often were very happy. Now, this is totally independent of the whole genetic thing that I'll talk in a minute about. Why? Because they had the same set of values. They had the same faith. They had the same idea about marriage, even the same sense of humor. They came from a similar world. So I'm not saying you have to marry cousins, which is also something I get very often on Twitter. Yeah. No, but you have to find people where these criteria are. Then your marriage will be easier, more fulfilling, more wonderful, because life throws so many curveballs at you. If these things are settled, then you will have a wonderful marriage. It's not about marrying the person who is most attractive at the moment, but you have, as you said, you have to switch on your brain, both sides, and talk it through and really get there. Do we agree on this? Do we agree on this? And yes, and just to get, indeed, the Habsburgs, the Spanish line of the Habsburgs died out because of genetic disease. And yes, that came from intermarrying too often in those 150 years, but no, and that's very important, and I insist on that, the Habsburg jaw, that one, didn't come from intermarrying. Now, everybody will say that's typical for inbreeding, but it's not, because if you just Google, you will find that the Habsburg jaw was already present 2 generations above, before the first Habsburg Spanish-Austrian marriages began. And it simply came from a grandmother of Emperor Maximilian, and it was a genetic disease, full stop. Had nothing to do with the inbreeding. So, I always like to put things right.
Get some corrections. It is amazing how much we've been taught about history, not just about the Habsburgs, but about history broadly. It just isn't true. Yes. And things that I was taught by my history teachers in, middle school, high school, college, all these places, and then you find out that isn't true, and then maybe sometimes you find out that the correction isn't true. And there are these processes where we go back and we revisit such things. A lot of people would say today, year of our Lord, 2023, this is the past. Oh, the Habsburg way. Here are the Habsburg rules. You're going to die well. You're going to pray for a long, conscious death. You're going to get married and have lots of children in an age where people don't even have 2 children to replace themselves. You're going to, believe in the empire? You're not allowed to say that naughty E word. The empire? What, are you crazy? And then one of your rules is be brave in battle. We're not going to battle. Bravery is nuts for suckers. We're going to stay at home and play video games. Maybe we'll be brave on the computer screen. Maybe.
Yes.
What do you say? This is completely antiquated. Yes. Edward, how dare you suggest this?
And that was, I think, also the line of the Slate magazine review of my book that led more or less with descendant of a defunct royal family tries to give us life lessons. Like, why would we even listen to this guy? Yes, you're right. But I'm only saying things that have been right for several 10,000 years. You are saying things that have been right since about 5 years.
And have they been so right?
I don't know.
How's
right?
that working out?
What I'm just saying is you're courageous to go with that. If this was the human reality, it's like what I say to atheists. I say you're very courageous because you stand against nearly the entire human history. Back 30,000 years before Christ, in cave paintings, they were all transcendent. They believed in an afterlife. Nearly every human being believed in an afterlife and in life after death. You're very courageous if you're an atheist.
I do wonder about just a little bit of epistemic humility. You know, these people who, very modern, and they say, no, we've figured it out. Everybody for all of human history thought one thing, but I've figured out they're all complete idiots and I'm right. And I think, I don't know if I'm right about very much, but I'm willing to side with statistically 100% of the wise, serious people from all of history.
You just unwittingly quoted my ancestor Charles V when he was confronted with Luther at the Diet of Worms, because he decided to bring all the empire together and to finally discuss this whole Protestant Reformation thing. And he listened to the arguments of Luther, and then he said, my family has for centuries stood with the church and stood for Catholic truth, for Our Lady, for prayer, and for these things. I would rather listen to the voice of the church for the last 1,500 years than to what a professor from Germany suddenly seems to think now. And then he declared him a heretic. It's a good instinct. It doesn't mean that everything in the past was better than today. This is ridiculous.
Right.
But just to totally condemn the last 10,000, 20,000 years just because they didn't have internet and TikTok. That's arrogance. Also, what do you think what people in 5 years will say about you? You are a Neanderthal. How could you still believe that there are only 64 genders? You know,
you backwards,
racist, crazy.
phobe,
So, in Germany, you say, who marries Zeitgeist will be widower very soon. That's why one of the topics is know who you are, know your roots. It's one of the chapters of my books. Know what you are, know where you come from, and stand by these values. The Habsburgs were always fiercely traditional in their values, and it's not that wrong.
Yeah. Well, before I let you go, I was struck too on this very point of humility by the funeral ritual, because there are all these paradoxes that keep popping up, and the most glaring paradox to me is the humility of emperors, including and especially at the moment of death.
Yes, I would like to tell 2 stories about that, because I feel that you really understand where the Habsburgs came from. When Queen Elizabeth was buried, you had practically half of humanity watching.
The most recent Queen Elizabeth.
Yes.
Number 2.
Always have to add that, not the other one, no. When her coffin was lowered into the crypt, and the soldier played on a trumpet this beautiful serenade, and they were reading out her titles. It was very touching, but I thought the Habsburgs did it better. And that's how I begin the chapter on the Habsburgs and dying with a knocking ritual that you can see on YouTube, because it was used not only in history, but 2 times in recent times when Empress Zita, the last empress of Austria-Hungary, died, and I was present when that happened, when that funeral happened, and when Otto died, our last head of family. Both times it was filmed, and you can watch it on YouTube. It's fantastic. And it, in a nutshell, explains the attitude of the Habsburg emperors about humility. So the coffin gets carried through the streets of Vienna, and you come to the Neue Markt, and you have the Capuchin church, and the entrance to the crypt. It's a door, big door. The master of ceremony walks up to the door. He knocks 3 times, and the voice of the Capuchin monk from inside says, "Who is there?" And he says, "Zita, Empress of Austria, Queen of Hungary, Queen of Bohemia," and then for about 20 seconds, all her titles. And the monk answers, "We don't know her." And then he knocks again. And the second time he says, all the achievements, what the emperor had done, which countries he had conquered, which peaces he had made, all of this, "We don't know her." And the third time knocks, says, "Who is there?" "Zita, a poor mortal sinner." And the door opens. And this is not just a ritual, it is the attitude. The Habsburgs were acutely aware that they were poor mortal sinners all their lives, even when they had crowns, when they had huge coats on. I wonder how many of our politicians are aware that they are poor mortal sinners, and how many of those nowadays political leaders admit to that. But the Habsburgs did that, always. And I want to end with a story quite from the beginning, from the 16th century. One of my favorite members of the family is Maximilian the First, the Last Knight, one of the most grandiose and dashing members of our family, who won the most beautiful princess in the world and the richest, and fought battles. He was magnificent. When he died, he gave 3 testament orders for after his death that for me speak volumes. The first was, he ordered his corpse to be shorn, his head shorn, teeth broken out, and flayed like our Christ at the scourging, and then exposed like that on the bier before being, and he had portraits done of his face like that and sent to all ends of the empire to show that the emperor is a poor mortal sinner. Grandiose, wonderful. It's alien to us now, but wow, what a gesture. There was always a teaching side of this. Learn about this. The second gesture, I've seen it with my own eyes. He ordered that his most beautiful coat, his most beautiful armor, was to be put up in kneeling position in a chapel of the church in Innsbruck, in front of the Blessed Sacrament, with folded hands. The armor, the empty armor, for all eternity. And if you go to Innsbruck and you come into the church and there is a right-hand side chapel, you will find this armor kneeling in front of the Blessed Sacrament. Now, of course, Maximilian knew that armors can't pray, but it was a sermon. It was a visible image that would teach people how important it is to pray and how important is Eucharistic devotion, but with a grandiose gesture, yeah? And the third thing, and I've also seen that in Wiener Neustadt, where he was buried, he didn't have a huge funeral monument, but when you go into the church, you will find the steps leading up to the high altar in that church from the 16th century. And the third step has just the word Maximilian on it. And that's where his coffin has been pushed in. And that's where his body lies, under the main altar, so that the priest would say Mass above his heart, above his chest, praying for him. Every time a priest would say Mass there, he would pray for him. I think that's fantastic. Now, of course, he didn't count on the reforms of Vatican II, so now Masses don't happen up there anymore, but at the normal altar down there. So, yeah. I'm not going to go down that tangent.
That will be for the next time you're in town. Because, Edward, I'll tell you, reading the book and hearing these stories, it's very easy to think, wow, that old way of life, that seems so foreign, that seems so distant. And we live in this new way of life now. But then the question we have to ask ourselves, looking around, dying civilization, everybody crazier than they've ever been, high rates of depression, anxiety, life expectancy decreasing, things aren't working out very well. And you think, well, maybe that old way of life has something to recommend it. Yes. And maybe we ought to reacquaint ourselves with that, which you can do in the Habsburg Way by Archduke Eduard Habsburg. Get the book now, read it, and then, most importantly, put it into practice. Edward, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Michael. That was a great talk.